sold with a sack over her head for $2, until a cowboy took off the cloth and said, "You're safe." The scorching Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty streets of Millbrook, casting long shadows between the weathered wooden buildings that lined the main thoroughfare. It was the kind of heat that made decent folk seek shade and drove desperate men to darker deeds. In the back alley behind Murphy's saloon, a gathering of rough-looking men formed a loose circle around a makeshift platform constructed from old wooden crates. Clara Hayes stood trembling on that crude stage, her world reduced to the suffocating darkness beneath a coarse burlap sack that covered her head. The rough fabric scratched against her face with each labored breath, and the stench of old grain and sweat filled her nostrils. Her hands were bound tightly behind her back with rope that cut into her wrists, and her legs shook beneath her worn cotton dress. The same dress she'd been wearing when they'd taken her from the ruins of her family's ranch 3 days ago. "What am I bid for this fine young specimen?" called out Silas Blackwood, a man whose reputation for cruelty preceded him into every town along the territorial border. His voice carried the practiced cadence of someone who'd conducted too many such auctions. "She's young, strong, and ready to work, perfect for any man looking for companionship." The crowd of men laughed with the kind of ugly sound that made Clara's skin crawl. She could hear their voices, some slurred with whiskey, others cold and calculating. They spoke about her as if she were livestock, discussing her potential value with casual cruelty that made her stomach turn. "2 bits!" someone shouted from the back. 50 cents! Called another. Clara tried to steady her breathing, fighting against the panic that threatened to overwhelm her. Just 4 days ago, she'd been helping her father tend to their small herd of cattle, watching the sunset paint the desert mountains in shades of gold and purple. Her mother had been preparing dinner, humming an old hymn while she worked. The bank notice had come that morning. Final notice, it had said in bold letters. But even then, even facing the loss of everything they'd worked for, Clara had never imagined it would come to this. The foreclosure had happened fast. Too fast for her parents to find another solution. Too fast for them to secure safe passage to her aunt's house in California. When the men had come in the night, her father had tried to fight them off with his old rifle, but there had been too many of them. The last thing Clara remembered from that terrible night was her mother's scream echoing across the desert as they dragged her away. $1! The bid came from somewhere to her left, followed by rough laughter. Blackwood's voice rose above the crowd. "Come now, gentlemen, surely this fine young lady is worth more than $1. Look at those hands, soft enough for fine work, strong enough for whatever else you might need." Clara bit her lip to keep from crying out. She could feel their eyes on her, assessing her like a piece of property. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains, and she knew that once darkness fell, her fate would be sealed. Whoever bought her would take her away from this place, away from any hope of rescue or escape. $1.50! The bidding continued in small increments, each increase sealing her fate a little more. Clara tried to think of her parents, wondering if they were even still alive. Had they managed to escape when the men took her? Were they out there somewhere searching for her? Or were they lying dead in the ruins of the only home she'd ever known? A new voice cut through her dark thoughts, deeper than the others, with a gravelly quality that spoke of too many years under the desert sun. $2. The crowd fell silent for a moment. Clara could sense the shift in the atmosphere, could feel the tension that suddenly filled the air around her. "Well, well," Blackwood said, his voice carrying a note of surprise. "Jake Morrison? Didn't expect to see you at one of my auctions. Thought you'd sworn off this kind of business." "Just making a bid, Blackwood." The voice, Jake Morrison's voice, was steady, controlled. $2, take it or leave it." $2 it is," Blackwood announced with fake cheerfulness. "Sold to Jake Morrison for $2. Clara felt her knees buckle slightly. $2. Her entire life, her freedom, her future, sold for less than the price of a decent meal. The reality of her situation crashed over her like a wave, and she had to bite down hard on her tongue to keep from sobbing. She heard boots approaching across the wooden platform, spurs jingling softly with each step. A hand touched her shoulder, not roughly like she'd expected, but with surprising gentleness. She flinched anyway, every muscle in her body tensing for whatever would come next. "Easy there," the voice said quietly, meant only for her ears. "I'm going to take this off now." Rough but careful fingers worked at the knot holding the sack in place. Clara squeezed her eyes shut, not wanting to see the face of the man who now owned her. The burlap fell away, and the late afternoon sun seemed blindingly bright after the darkness she'd endured. When her eyes finally adjusted, she found herself looking into a weathered face that belonged to a man in his 30s. His dark hair was streaked with premature grey at the temples, and his brown eyes held a depth of sadness that seemed to match her own. He wore the typical attire of a working cowboy, worn leather chaps, a faded blue shirt, and a hat that had seen better days. "You're safe," he said simply, his voice carrying a conviction that made her want to believe him despite everything that had just happened. Around them, the crowd was beginning to disperse, the other men heading back into the saloon or mounting their horses to ride out of town. Blackwood approached them, his hand extended expectantly. "That'll be $2, Morrison." Jake reached into his vest pocket and pulled out 2 silver dollars, placing them in Blackwood's palm without a word. The transaction complete, Blackwood tipped his hat mockingly and disappeared into the crowd. Clara stood frozen on the platform, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. This man, this Jake Morrison, had just bought her. But instead of the leering cruelty she'd expected, she saw something else in his eyes, something that looked almost like regret. "What happens now?" she whispered, her voice hoarse from hours of crying and fear. Jake looked at her for a long moment, then at the rope still binding her wrists. Without a word, he pulled a knife from his belt and cut through the bonds. The relief was immediate. Blood rushed back into her hands, bringing with it a painful tingling sensation. "Now," he said, folding the knife and returning it to his belt, "we get you somewhere safe, and then we figure out how to get you home." Clara rubbed her raw wrists, staring at Jake Morrison in disbelief. The chaos of the dispersing auction crowd swirled around them, but his words seemed to hang in the air between them, like something too fragile to trust. "Home," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of boots on wooden planks and horses being mounted. "There is no home anymore." Jake's jaw tightened, and she caught a flicker of something, pain perhaps, cross his features. He glanced around the alley, his eyes scanning the remaining men with the practiced wariness of someone who'd learned to expect trouble. "We can't talk here," he said, taking her elbow gently but firmly. "Too many ears, and Blackwood's got friends in this town. Can you walk?" Clara nodded, though her legs felt unsteady beneath her. Jake guided her down from the makeshift platform, his hand remaining at her elbow to steady her. As they moved through the alley, she noticed how the other men stepped aside, some with respectful nods, others with barely concealed hostility. Whatever Jake Morrison's reputation was in this place, it commanded both respect and wariness. They emerged onto Main Street just as the sun touched the tops of the distant mountains. The golden light painted the dusty town in deceptively warm colors, making the ramshackle buildings look almost welcoming. But Clara had learned in these past few days that appearances in frontier towns could be deadly deceiving. Jake led her toward a small boarding house at the end of the street, its white-painted facade less weathered than most of the other buildings. A hand-carved sign reading "Widow McCready's" hung from a post near the front steps. "Mrs. McCready," Jake called as they approached the porch. "You got a room available?" An elderly woman appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on a flour-dusted apron. Her silver hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her sharp blue eyes took in Clara's appearance with the kind of quick assessment that spoke of a woman who'd seen her share of trouble. "Jake Morrison," she said, her voice carrying a slight Scottish accent. "What kind of trouble are you bringing to my door this time?" "The kind that needs a safe place to sleep and a hot meal," Jake replied. "This is Miss Hayes. She's had a rough few days." Mrs. Macready's expression softened as she looked at Clara more carefully, taking in the torn dress, the rope burns on her wrists, and the haunted look in her eyes. "Aye, I can see that. Come in, child. We'll get you cleaned up and fed." The interior of the boarding house was simple but clean, with lace curtains at the windows and the comforting smell of bread baking in the kitchen. Mrs. Macready led them to a small parlour furnished with worn but comfortable chairs. "Sit yourself down, dear," she told Clara. "I'll bring some tea and something to eat." As the older woman bustled away, Clara found herself alone with Jake for the first time. He remained standing near the window, his attention split between her and the street outside. "Why did you help me?" she asked suddenly. The question had been burning in her mind since he'd cut her bonds. Jake was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on something beyond the window. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough with emotion. "Had a sister once, about your age. She—" He stopped, his jaw working silently. "Let's just say I know what happens to girls in your situation. Couldn't let it happen again." The weight of his words settled between them. Clara studied his profile. The lines around his eyes that spoke of too much sun and too many hard decisions, the set of his shoulders that suggested a man carrying burdens he'd never chosen. "What happened to her?" Clara asked softly. "She died," Jake said simply. 3 years ago. Could have been prevented if someone had stepped in when they should have." Mrs. Macready returned with a tray bearing tea, thick slices of bread, and a bowl of hearty stew. Clara hadn't realized how hungry she was until the smell hit her, and she had to fight the urge to grab the food immediately. "Easy, child," Mrs. Macready said kindly. "There's plenty more where that came from." As Clara ate, Jake explained the situation in broad strokes, careful not to reveal too many details, but enough for the widow to understand the gravity of the circumstances. "Blackwood's involved, you say?" Mrs. Macready's expression grew grim. "That man's been poison in this territory for years. The law won't touch him, too many officials in his pocket. Which is why we can't stay here long." Jake said, "Soon as word gets around that I bought her, questions will start getting asked. Blackwood doesn't like losing his merchandise, especially when it's taken right out from under him." Clara looked up from her meal, fear creeping back into her voice. "Merchandise? Is that all I am to him?" "Not to him and not to me," Jake said firmly, "but to men like Blackwood, yes. That's how they see women like you, girls who've lost their families, their homes, their protection. They prey on desperation." "My parents," Clara said suddenly. "Do you know what happened to them? Are they still alive?" Jake exchanged a look with Mrs. Macready before answering carefully. "I don't know for certain, but I intend to find out. There's a man I know in Phoenix, a federal marshal who's been trying to build a case against Blackwood's operation. If anyone would know about your folks, it'd be him." "Phoenix is 3 days' hard ride from here," Mrs. Macready observed. "And Blackwood's got men all along that route." "I know," Jake said grimly, "but it's our best shot. We can't go to the local law. Half of them are in Blackwood's pocket, and the other half are too scared to stand up to him." Clara set down her spoon, her appetite suddenly gone despite her hunger. "You're talking about risking your life for someone you don't even know. Why would you do that?" Jake finally turned from the window to face her directly. "Because sometimes a man has to take a stand, even if it's too late to matter for the people he couldn't save before." The room fell silent, except for the ticking of a mantel clock and the distant sounds of the town settling into evening. Clara could see the weight of old guilt in Jake's eyes, could sense the ghosts that haunted him. But she could also see something else, a determination that gave her the first real hope she'd felt in days. "What do you need me to do?" she asked quietly. Jake nodded, as if her question confirmed something he'd been wondering about her character. Rest tonight. Tomorrow at dawn, we ride out. It won't be easy. We'll have to avoid the main roads, travel through some rough country. But if we can make it to Phoenix, we might have a chance, Clara finished. More than a chance, Jake said. A real shot at justice. Outside, the sun had disappeared behind the mountains, and the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Clara looked out at them, thinking of all the nights she'd spent on her family's ranch, dreaming of a future that had seemed so certain then. Now everything was uncertain, dangerous, and frightening. But for the first time since this nightmare began, she wasn't facing it alone. Clara woke before dawn to the sound of horses' hooves thundering past the boarding house. Through the thin curtains of her small room, she could see lanterns bobbing in the pre-dawn darkness as riders moved through the streets of Millbrook. Her blood ran cold. She knew instinctively that they were searching for her. A soft knock at her door made her heart jump. "Miss Hayes," came Mrs. Macready's whispered voice. "Jake says it's time to go. Now." Clara quickly pulled on the clean dress Mrs. Macready had provided the night before, simple brown cotton that would blend in with the desert landscape. Her hands shook as she laced up the worn boots the widow had found for her, boots that would need to carry her across miles of unforgiving terrain. In the kitchen, Jake was already waiting, his saddlebags packed and his rifle checked and loaded. His face was grim in the lamplight, and Clara could see the tension in every line of his body. "Blackwood's got men combing the town," he said without preamble. "Someone must have told him I didn't take you to the usual place his buyers go. We've got maybe an hour before they figure out where you are." Mrs. Macready pressed a bundle of food into Clara's hands. Bread, dried meat, and a water skin. "There's enough for 3 days if you're careful," she said. "And child?" She grasped Clara's shoulders, her blue eyes fierce with conviction. "You trust Jake Morrison. He's a good man who's made some hard choices. Don't let his past fool you into thinking he won't do right by you." They slipped out the back of the boarding house into an alley where Jake had tied 2 horses, his own chestnut gelding and a smaller mare that looked sturdy enough for hard travel. "Can you ride?" Jake asked, checking the cinch on the mare's saddle. "Yes," Clara replied. She'd been riding since she was old enough to sit in a saddle, though never for the kind of desperate flight they were about to attempt. Jake helped her mount, his touch professional and respectful. "We're going to head south first. Make it look like we're heading toward the Mexican border. Then we'll swing east toward Phoenix. The route's longer, but it'll keep us away from Blackwood's main operations." As they rode quietly through the sleeping town, Clara caught glimpses of the search parties, rough men with lanterns, checking every building, every shadow. Her heart pounded so loudly she was certain they would hear it, but Jake guided them through back alleys and side streets with the skill of someone who knew every hiding place in Millbrook. They reached the outskirts of town just as the eastern sky began to show the first pale hints of dawn. Jake urged their horses into a steady lope across the desert floor, heading toward a line of rocky hills that would provide cover from pursuing eyes. For the first hour, they rode in silence, both listening for the sound of pursuit. The desert was awakening around them, coyotes calling in the distance, the rustle of small creatures in the sagebrush, the whisper of wind across sand and stone. Clara had always found comfort in these sounds when she lived on the ranch, but now they seemed ominous, as if danger lurked behind every shadow. When they reached a narrow canyon that cut between 2 red sandstone ridges, Jake finally allowed them to slow to a walk. "We'll rest the horses here for a few minutes," he said, dismounting near a small seep spring that provided precious water in the arid landscape. Clara slid down from her mare, her legs already aching from the unaccustomed riding. She'd grown soft during the months before the foreclosure, when illness had kept her closer to the house and away from the daily work of ranching. "Jake," she said as they watered the horses, "tell me about this marshal in Phoenix. How do you know we can trust him?" Jake's expression grew thoughtful as he watched his gelding drink. "Marshal Tom Garrett. We served together in the cavalry before he took the federal job. He's been trying to build a case against Blackwood's operation for 2 years, but he needs witnesses, people who've seen the trafficking firsthand and are willing to testify. And you think I might be that witness? I think you might be more than that, Jake said carefully. The way Blackwood handled your auction, it was sloppy, desperate, like he needed quick cash for something big. If Garrett can connect that to his other evidence... A distant sound made them both freeze, the drumming of multiple horses' hooves echoing off the canyon walls. Jake's hand moved instinctively to his rifle. "Mount up," he said urgently. "Now!" They swung back into their saddles and urged their horses deeper into the canyon, but the pursuing sounds grew closer. Clara could hear voices now, rough, angry voices that carried clearly in the thin desert air. "Morrison!" The shout echoed off the rock walls. "We know you're in there! Bring out the girl, and maybe we'll let you ride away!" Jake guided them to a narrow side canyon that branched off from the main passage. It was barely wide enough for their horses, the sandstone walls rising high on either side. "If something happens to me," Jake said quietly, not looking back at her, "you keep riding east. Follow the North Star at night, the sun during the day. Phoenix is maybe 50 miles from here." "Nothing's going to happen to you," Clara said with more confidence than she felt. The sound of horses entering the main canyon grew louder. Clara could hear them spreading out, searching every possible hiding place. Her mare shifted nervously beneath her, sensing the tension. "There!" someone shouted. "Fresh tracks heading into that side canyon." Jake drew his rifle and turned to face the mouth of their hiding place. "Clara, get behind those rocks up ahead. Whatever happens, don't come out until you're sure they're gone." She wanted to argue, wanted to stay and help him fight, but she could see in his eyes that he needed to know she was safe in order to do what he had to do. The first rider appeared at the canyon mouth, a lean man with a black mustache and a scar running down his left cheek. Clara recognized him as one of Blackwood's lieutenants from the auction. "Well, well," the man called out. "Jake Morrison playing hero again. You cost our boss a lot of money yesterday." "She's not for sale, Hawkins," Jake replied steadily. "Find yourself another girl to traffic." Hawkins laughed, a sound without humor. "See, that's where you're wrong, Morrison. She's already been sold. Money changed hands. That makes her Blackwood's property until she's delivered to the buyer." More riders appeared behind Hawkins, 4 men total, all armed, all with the hard look of men who'd killed before and wouldn't hesitate to do it again. "Here's how this is going to work," Hawkins continued. "You're going to hand over the girl, and we're going to forget this little rescue attempt ever happened. Make the wrong choice, and we'll leave your bones for the coyotes." Jake's response was to lever around into his rifle's chamber. The metallic sound echoed off the canyon walls like a challenge. "Guess you made your choice," Hawkins said, reaching for his sidearm. The canyon exploded into violence. Jake's first shot took Hawkins from his saddle, but the other 3 men were already drawing their weapons. Clara watched in terror from behind the rocks as gunfire echoed between the stone walls, the sound deafening in the confined space. Jake used the narrow canyon to his advantage, making it impossible for more than 1 man to approach him at a time. But Clara could see that he was outnumbered, and it would only be a matter of time before their superior numbers told. One of Blackwood's men had dismounted and was working his way along the canyon wall, using the rocks for cover as he tried to get a flanking shot on Jake. Clara saw him raising his rifle, saw the deadly angle he had on the man who'd risked everything to save her. Without thinking, she picked up a loose stone and hurled it as hard as she could. It struck the gunman in the shoulder, spoiling his aim just as he fired. The shot went wide, but it gave away Clara's position. "There she is!" the man shouted. The remaining 2 riders turned their attention toward her hiding place, giving Jake the opening he needed. His rifle spoke twice more, and suddenly the canyon fell silent, except for the ringing echoes of gunshots and the nervous whickering of frightened horses. Jake appeared at her side, his face grim, but relieved. "Are you hurt?" Clara shook her head, though her hands were trembling from the adrenaline and shock of what she'd just witnessed. "We need to move," Jake said, helping her to her feet. "Gunshots carry in this country. Every man within 5 miles heard that fight." They mounted their horses and rode deeper into the maze of canyons, leaving behind the bodies of men who'd chosen the wrong side of justice. Clara tried not to look back, tried not to think about how close they'd come to capture or death. But as they rode toward an uncertain future, she realized something had changed inside her. She was no longer just a victim being rescued. She was a survivor fighting for her freedom, and she would do whatever it took to reach Phoenix alive. The federal marshal's office in Phoenix was a stark contrast to the rough frontier buildings Clara had grown accustomed to over the past week. Clean white walls, organized paperwork, and the solid presence of law and order made her feel safer than she had since leaving her family's ranch. But as she sat across from Marshal Tom Garrett, recounting her ordeal for the 3rd time, she could see the weight of responsibility in his weathered features. "Miss Hayes," Marshal Garrett said, setting down his pen and leaning back in his chair, "your testimony is exactly what we've been waiting for. But I need you to understand what you're agreeing to. Testifying against Silas Blackwood means putting your life at risk. The man has connections throughout the territory, and he doesn't leave loose ends." Jake shifted in his chair beside her, his hand resting protectively near his sidearm. They'd made the journey to Phoenix in 4 grueling days, avoiding main roads and sleeping rough under the desert stars. Each day had brought them closer to safety, but also deeper into danger, as Blackwood's network of informants and hired guns spread word of their escape. "I understand the risks," Clara said quietly. "But Marshal, if I don't testify, how many other girls will end up on that auction block? How many families will be destroyed the way mine was?" Garrett nodded approvingly. "You're braver than most grown men I know, miss. And you're right. Your testimony could shut down Blackwood's entire operation. We've been building this case for 2 years. But we needed someone who'd actually witnessed the auctions, someone who could identify the buyers and describe how the whole system works." Through the window, Clara could see the bustling streets of Phoenix, already busy despite the early morning hour. Merchants were setting up their stalls, families were heading to church, children were playing in the dusty roads. It was a normal world, a world where girls weren't sold like cattle and desperate men didn't prey on the vulnerable. It was the world she wanted to help protect. "There's something else," Jake said, speaking for the first time since they'd entered the marshal's office. "Clara's parents. Have you found out anything about what happened to them?" Marshal Garrett's expression grew more serious. "I sent a deputy out to the Hayes Ranch 3 days ago after you telegraphed that you were coming. Mr. and Mrs. Hayes are alive, Jake. They're staying with neighbors about 20 miles east of where their ranch used to be." Clara felt tears spring to her eyes, tears of relief so overwhelming she could barely speak. "They're alive? They're really alive?" "Very much so," Garrett confirmed. "And according to my deputy, they've been moving heaven and earth trying to find you. Your father's been riding from town to town, following every rumor and lead, no matter how dangerous. Your mother's been working with the territorial governor's office, trying to get official help. The weight of the past week, the fear, the desperation, the constant uncertainty about her family's fate, suddenly lifted from Clara's shoulders. She buried her face in her hands and wept, not from sorrow this time, but from pure relief. Jake's hand settled gently on her shoulder. "It's over, Clara. The worst part is over." But Marshal Garrett cleared his throat, bringing their attention back to the serious business at hand. "I'm afraid it's not quite over yet. We still have to catch Blackwood, and that won't be easy. My sources tell me he's planning to leave the territory within the next few days, probably heading down into Mexico where we can't touch him. Then we need to move fast," Jake said. "Already in motion," Garrett replied. "I've got deputies positioned at every major route out of Millbrook and the surrounding area. But Blackwood's smart. He'll try to slip through somewhere we don't expect." Clara looked up from her hands, her eyes still wet with tears, but her voice steady with determination. He'll use the same routes he uses for trafficking. The hidden trails, the places where decent folks don't go. Both men turned to look at her, and she could see the questions in their eyes. During the auction, she explained, I heard some of the men talking. They mentioned places. Dead Horse Canyon, the old Apache Trail through Sunset Pass, a ranch called the Broken Wheel, where they sometimes held girls before selling them. If Blackwood's running, he'll use those same routes because he knows they're safe from normal law enforcement. Marshal Garrett was already reaching for a map, spreading it across his desk. Show me, he said urgently. Clara studied the terrain, remembering fragments of conversations she'd overheard during the most terrifying experience of her life. Slowly, she began pointing to locations, describing what she'd heard about Blackwood's network of safe houses and hidden trails. There, she said, her finger resting on a remote area near the Mexican border. The Broken Wheel Ranch. If he's running for Mexico, that's where he'll go first to collect his money and his most valuable merchandise. Jake and Marshal Garrett exchanged grim looks. They both knew what valuable merchandise meant, other girls like Clara, waiting in terrible conditions for buyers who might never come. How long to get there? Jake asked. If we ride hard, we can make it by nightfall, Garrett replied. But I'll need every available deputy, and even then we'll be outnumbered. You'll have me too, Jake said simply. Jake, no, Clara protested. You've done enough. You've risked enough. He turned to face her, his brown eyes serious but gentle. Clara, I told you about my sister. She died because no one was willing to take the final step, to see justice all the way through. I won't make that mistake again. Marshal Garrett stood up, already reaching for his gun belt. Then it's settled. We ride in 1 hour. He paused, looking at Clara. Miss Hayes, I'm going to arrange for you to be taken to your parents while we handle Blackwood. They're waiting for you in a safe house about 10 miles from here. Clara started to protest, but Jake spoke first. He's right, Clara. This last part isn't your fight anymore. You've done more than enough. An hour later, Clara stood in the dusty street outside the marshal's office, watching as Jake checked his rifle one final time before mounting his horse. Around him, 6 federal deputies were making their final preparations for what could be a deadly confrontation. Jake, she called out softly. He rode over to where she stood beside the wagon that would take her to safety and her long-awaited reunion with her parents. Thank you, she said simply, for everything. For seeing me as a person worth saving when everyone else saw me as merchandise. Jake touched the brim of his hat, but his eyes held a warmth that hadn't been there when they'd first met. You saved yourself, Clara. I just gave you the chance. Will I see you again? She asked. Count on it, he replied. Soon as this business with Blackwood is finished, I'll be coming to check on you. Make sure you're settling in with your folks. As the posse rode out of Phoenix in a cloud of dust, Clara climbed into the wagon that would take her home. But she found herself looking back, watching until Jake's figure disappeared into the shimmering heat waves rising from the desert floor. 3 days later, word reached the small ranch where Clara was reuniting with her parents. Marshal Garrett's posse had found the Broken Wheel Ranch and rescued 4 other girls who'd been held there for weeks. Silas Blackwood had been killed in the gunfight that followed, his network of buyers and traffickers broken up across the territory. Jake Morrison had taken a bullet in the shoulder during the fight, but he'd survived. More importantly, he'd finally found the peace that had eluded him since his sister's death. When he came to visit Clara and her family 2 weeks later, his arm still in a sling, he found her helping her mother tend a small garden behind their new home. The sight of her safe, surrounded by people who loved her, working toward a future she'd chosen for herself, was better than any reward he could have imagined. Miss Hayes, he called out with a smile in his voice. She turned, her face lighting up with genuine joy. It's just Clara, she said, running to greet the man who'd given her back her life. And you're always welcome here, Jake Morrison. Always. As the Arizona sun set behind them, painting the desert in shades of gold and purple, Clara knew that while her ordeal had changed her forever, it had also shown her the strength she'd never known she possessed. She was no longer the frightened girl who'd stood on that auction block. She was a survivor, a witness to justice, and most importantly, she was free. The nightmare was over. Her real life could finally begin. What did you think of Clara and Jake's incredible journey from that terrifying auction block to final justice? Their story of courage, redemption, and the fight against human trafficking in the Old West shows us that even in the darkest moments, there are people willing to stand up for what's right. If this story moved you, please hit that like button and let me know in the comments what part impacted you the most. Was it Jake's decision to intervene, Clara's bravery in helping bring down Blackwood's network, or perhaps the emotional reunion with her family? Don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories of survival and justice from America's frontier days. Your support helps me bring these untold tales of courage to light.